Again, my name is Nate. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here on this August Sunday. I hope that you've had a good summer as they're winding down. We're winding down our summer series as well called Obscure Heroes. And if this is your first exposure to it, the idea is we kind of know the heavy hitters in the Bible, right? We know some of the main characters. We know the Davids and the Moseses and the Abrahams and the Pauls and the Johns and Peter. We know those folks. But tucked away in the Bible, sir, if you could please find your seat. So I just always want to do that. Tucked away in the Bible are these folks that we just see for a chapter or two. We just get little snippets or little glimpses into the lives of these folks. But the examples that they leave through their stories are profound. And we wanted to take some time in the summer and focus in on some of these stories. So this morning, we're looking at the story of a woman named Rahab. Rahab, when we meet her in Joshua chapter 2. Now, Rahab lived in a city called Jericho. To understand why that's important, what we have to realize is that the people of Israel, God's chosen nation, have come out of Egypt. They've come out of slavery. They've lived in the desert for 40 years, and now they're about to cross over the Jordan River. They're on the east side of this river. They're about to cross over the river and go on a conquest to conquer what we know as the modern-day nation, land of Israel. To them, it was the land of Canaan, and Joshua was going to lead his armies over the river and then through the nation to sweep through and take over all the cities for themselves per God's orders. God had already told them, be strong and courageous. I'm going to give everybody to you in battle when you fight in my name. And so the first city on the list was a city named Jericho. And like good war planners do, they had to go get some intel. So Joshua finds two spies and he sends them into Jericho to go see what they could see and come back, and they would come up with a strategy on how to attack this city. So when the spies go into Jericho, they end up in the house of a woman named Rahab. Now, Rahab was a prostitute. And I like to think that these men were there not because they were of a weak moral fiber, but because it made sense for people coming in and out of town to spend the night at her house, because this was something that was done a lot. So this would kind of throw people off the scent. It makes sense for some transient businessmen to come in, spend the night there, and then leave the next day without raising too many eyebrows. So I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. But when we meet Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, one of the first things we learn about her is that she was a prostitute. She was used to this kind of thing. But the men come in, and somehow or another, the king of Jericho, the authorities in Jericho, get word that there are some spies in their city. And so they start trying to find them. And then they hear that they're probably in Rahab's house. But Rahab, who has every reason to hand them over to the king, she doesn't need this stress in her life. Like, she doesn't need this drama. I don't know what her life looked like at the time, but I'm sure it had plenty enough drama that she didn't need to be hiding spies from the government. It would have been way easier for her to just let the king in and say they're right there and go get them. But that's not what she does. She actually, we see, she goes up to them. They're sleeping on the roof. And we see in Joshua chapter 2, verse 8, that this is Rahab's response when she encounters God. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof. Verse 9, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. And she goes on. She goes on and she's talking about their fear, and she makes a deal. She says, so here's the deal. I'm going to hide you. I'm going to protect you. I'll lie to the king for you. I'll give you an escape route. But I need to know that when your armies come through Jericho and conquer us, that you're going to protect me and my family. I'll make a deal with you. And I love this response from Rahab, because what we'll see as we move through her story is that Rahab's response to God was faithful obedience. Rahab's response to God was faithful obedience. Think about it. This is a woman that's presumably grown up in Jericho. We don't know what their religion was, but it was what we would refer to as a pagan religion. She didn't worship the God that we worship. She didn't worship the Hebrew God. This was a land and a time when each civilization and each culture had their own gods, and they would always vie for power with each other. That's why the 10 plagues in Egypt was actually a strategic affront to 10 different gods of Egypt to show the nation of Egypt that the Hebrew God is more powerful than your God. And so if you had any national pride at all, if you had any cultural pride, you would always say that your God was stronger than the other gods. Except when she encounters the Hebrew God and hears of the stories of the Hebrew God and what they're doing and what he's doing for Joshua and his armies, she responds in fear. And then that fear produces obedience. Because she had a choice. She can hand over the spies and do what's easy for her, or she can protect them and take that on. And she chose, in faithful obedience, to protect them. And I call this obedience to God. And here's what I think is super interesting about this step of obedience that Rahab took. Would we call her a Christian? No. Was she a believer? Was she a Hebrew? Was she practicing? Was she following the law and performing the sacrifices and going to temple? Did she know the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible? Did she know even who Moses was? Did she know the story of Abraham or Noah? Did she know any of this stuff or any of the things around the religion that she was being obedient to? No. She just knew that God was coming and she wanted to be on the right side of things. So she took the step of obedience that was in front of her. And she helped the spies. I love that response from Rahab. So she tells the spies, I'm going to hide you. I'm going to lower you out of my window because her house was actually in the city walls of Jericho. She says, I'm going to lower you out my window and you go hide in those hills over there. And then when the king comes to check on you, I'm going to send them the other direction. Stay in the hills for 3 days. After that, you're good. You can go back and rejoin your army. And so they said, that's great. Thank you. If on the day that we attack, if you will hang a scarlet cord from your window, then we promise that we will protect you and anybody who is in this house. They say, okay, deal. So she lets him down. Sure enough, king knocks on her door. She gives him the old that away. You know, they went over there and lies to him, which is an interesting thing to know because God counts this to her as righteousness. So sometimes lying is okay. Just so we're clear, there's a hierarchy of things that we're supposed to do to love others. And in this situation, she was supposed to love on the spies and obey God by deceiving the king. All right? So this absolutism of morality doesn't really work sometimes. It's just a useless aside for you. But she lets him down the window. They get away. She sends the king in another direction, and everybody's safe. And then a little while later, we have the famous Battle of Jericho, where God's strategy from on high was to march around the city 7 times, which seems, first of all, ineffective, and second of all, tiring. But I've actually gotten the chance to be at Jericho and see the size of it, and actually look down in a dig and see the excavation and the layers of the walls. And towards the bottom, there's this one black layer of soot from the walls being burnt down this one time, which is super interesting. And the whole size of Jericho is maybe the size of the parking lot that's across the street. So walking around it 7 times in a day isn't unfeasible. It's not like a triumph of the human spirit or anything. So that's what they did. And on the 7th time, the walls fell down. The armies of Joshua swept into Jericho, took over the city. But because the cord was hanging from Rahab's window, they protected her and her family and grafted her into the nation in a way that you'll see in a minute. And I think that Rahab's faith is remarkable. One of the reasons I think it's remarkable, and I don't know how much time you've spent thinking about this, probably not much. I tried to really think through it this week. And I have to make some guesses here, but I think that you'll give me the license and the liberty to make these guesses. What was Rahab's life like? What happened in her life that she ended up as a prostitute? Women in that day, and it goes without saying that it's totally wrong, but women in that day had very little value outside of being a wife. They could not have a profession. They had no opportunity to make money. And so to be on your own as a woman is to have very few options. And so she took the only option that was in front of her. And so what it tells me is she either experienced loss or rejection or both in her life. Maybe she had a husband and he passed, and so now she had to fend for herself. Maybe she wanted to be married and she couldn't. Women in that culture very much wanted to be married. They had no way to provide for themselves. They needed to get married. And so it's safe to say that almost every woman in that culture had this innate desire to find a husband. And for whatever reason, she finds herself without one, either through loss or rejection. I wonder what kind of number that would have done on the psyche, on the self-image, on the hope of this woman. More than that, she's a prostitute in ancient Jericho. What was that like? There's no justice system there. If there was, it was nothing like ours. It was a place where might made right. It was a patriarchy. I don't know what she had to do to avoid abuse from some. I don't know what she had to do to gain the protection that she was afforded. I don't know the kinds of awful things that she saw that if we close our eyes, we would still be seeing. I don't know what that woman's life was like, but I guarantee you it's harder than mine. I guarantee you she saw and experienced things that you can't unsee. I wonder what it would be like for Rahab to sit in the office of a therapist or a counselor. I wonder what layers would have to begin to get peeled back from her about trust that she lost early, about feeling worthless, about feeling shame over who she was. I wonder what it was like when Rahab was being honest to look in the mirror. I think that Rahab was a broken woman. And in that brokenness, when confronted with God, without understanding all the ramifications about it, she chose obedience. And for that, it's amazing, for that, this foreign woman who had the worst job that churches think you could have, she is put in the Bible dozens of times. God shares her story throughout the Old Testament. She's mentioned again and again, and she shows up two places that I know of in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, she shows up in one of the most famous chapters in the Bible, Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to finish the series with looking at Hebrews chapter 11. Some people call it the Hall of Faith. The book of Hebrews is easily the most beautifully written book in the New Testament. We don't know who the author was, but it's so eloquent and good that we go, that probably is not Paul, because we've read a lot of his books. It has the highest view of Christ, of Christology in the New Testament. It really holds him up as the high priest and the sacrifice and the Messiah once and for all. It's a beautiful book and absolutely worth delving into. And in chapter 11, the author wants to make the point of how important faith is, how impactful faith can be. And so the author goes through the heroes of the Old Testament and says, by faith Noah built the ark, and by faith Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, and by faith Moses led them through the desert, and he goes on and on and on until he gets to Rahab, who by faith protected the spies in Jericho. And here, this foreign broken prostitute is laid right next to these Jewish men who are heroes of the faith. And God says, the things that they did to me are the same. The things that they did to me have the same faith, have the same obedience, have the same heart. And she's held up as a hero of the faith alongside with these men who made the choices that they made. And God says they're equal, because she responded to God with faithful obedience. That's remarkable to me. It's remarkable to me because do you know how concerned God is with the Jewish lineage in the Old Testament? He tells them over and over and over again, do not intermarry. When you move into this nation, do not take wives or husbands from the surrounding cultures. And he even punishes them for doing it sometimes. He'll ostracize them for doing it, but yet here in Rahab, he's grafted in someone into his people, into his family, who is a foreign woman of ill repute. And it goes to show us that God was never concerned with protecting the genetics of his people. He was always concerned with protecting the faith. He doesn't care about what our makeup is or what we look like or how we were born. He cares about our faith as we respond to him. And so because Rahab responded with faith, he grafts her into his family. But to me, as I researched this, I knew that Rahab was in Hebrews chapter 11, so I turned to that and I read through that and kind of let that soak in. But I also know that she shows up in one of the most boring chapters in the Bible, Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1 is the begats. It's so-and-so, had so-and-so, had so-and-so, had so-and-so, had so-and-so. All the way down is a whole chapter. It's really fun to read it out loud and see how good you do at pronouncing the names. It's fun if you're like a huge Bible nerd like me. That's like a great time. Let's sit around with our friends and pronounce Bible names. But you can go through that, and it's just super boring, man. It's hard to read. Like if that one shows up on your quiet time that day, you're going to fold it up and be like, God, I got nothing. I'm so sorry. There's actually a great sermon there, and I want to do it one day, but I have to get my ego out of the way because I really want to say that I've done a sermon out of Matthew chapter 1. But there's really a great sermon there. One day I'll share it with you. But Rahab shows up there too. And we can put it up on the screen. This is where she shows up. I thought it was remarkable as I read this. It says that she married a man named Salmon, and together they had a son named Boaz. And Boaz with Ruth had a son named Obed, and Obed had a son named Jesse, and Jesse had a son named David. There's a lot going on there. There's a whole lot going on there. Now, I'm going to make some guesses about Rahab if you'll give me the chance to do this. Rahab married a man named Salmon. Maybe the Jews pronounced it Salmon, but I can't bring myself to do it. She married a man named Salmon. Salmon was from the line of Abraham. Salmon took great pride in his forefathers. He had to have. The whole line of Abraham did. It would have been a huge deal for him to marry a foreign woman who used to be a prostitute. So my guess about Rahab is, after taking that initial step of obedience when she encountered God, is that once she got grafted into the Hebrew culture and the Hebrew faith, and she began to look around, and she began to step into synagogue where she would find community, and she began to adopt the values of the people around her, that she continued to respond to God and his word, and that she grafted herself into the faith. And that she continued to take steps of obedience. I doubt very seriously that after the Battle of Jericho, Rahab ever returned to her previous profession. I think God got a hold of her and moved in that way. Can I tell you the main reason I believe that? There's this old saying, I don't know if you guys have heard it before, but you can't fake good kids. When there's a group of brothers and sisters coming out of a house and they're spiritually strong and they love God and they have good character and they're great folks, you have to, whether you like them or not, give credit to their parents. You have to look at their parents and go, I don't know what they were doing, but it was good. You can't fake good kids. Now, sometimes kids can come out of messes and become really great humans, but that's not typically how that story goes. Usually, if you have a great kid, you can find some great parents. And Rahab and Salmon had a great kid. Their kid was a guy named Boaz. And Boaz stands out in the Old Testament as an example of what the Messiah is going to look like. You understand this? There's a girl named Ruth. She was a Moabite woman who had no options and no hope. She wasn't very different than her, I guess it was her grandmother, Rahab. Or was mother-in-law? Is that how that works? I don't know. I should have planned this part of the sermon. She wasn't very much different than her. And she comes in, she's hopeless, she's a beggar, taking what she can at the corners of fields. Boaz says, we need to protect her. Nobody lay a hand on her. And then, knowing her situation and taking and having empathy for her, having compassion for her, makes her his wife, marries her into his family, and restores to her all the rights and privileges of a citizen of Israel. He redeems her. In theological circles, he's known as the kinsman redeemer, or a type Christ. And Boaz stands for all of time as a picture in the Old Testament of what the Messiah is going to look like when he gets here in the New Testament. And that's Rahab's kid. And I don't think that he comes from that home with those values if Rahab doesn't continue to respond to God in faithful obedience. And Ruth and Boaz have Obed, who has Jesse, who has David. Because of her faithful obedience, God didn't just pluck her out of the life that she was living and give her a new life. He didn't just put her on the pages of Hebrews thousands of years later to be displayed for all of time with an equivalency to all the other people of faith who had preceded her. He wrote her into the genetics of his son and used her to bring about two pictures of his son in David and in Boaz. God had an incredible story written for Rahab. And so as I look at her story, and I think about this woman in Jericho who must have felt hopeless and broken, and what God saw in her, and why we even get to see the story of Rahab in the Bible, what I see is that God made beauty out of her brokenness. God made beauty out of her brokenness. I picture Rahab as this vase or a bowl or a vessel that's just been shattered on the ground. I wanted to bring in like a clay pot and shatter it, but that would have been dangerous for like Holly and other people around me. So I had no way to do that, but that's how I picture Rahab, just broken and shattered on the floor. Irrevocably damaged, and in different ways trying to grab pieces of her life and put them back together in a way that feels whole, in a way that feels healthy, in a way that can at least look from the outside in like it's beautiful. I imagine her trying to assemble the pieces of her own life, and I think many of us can relate to this. I think many of us are broken. Listen, if we're being honest, we all are. We're all broken. And I don't mean that in some dramatic way. Some of us are walking through really difficult things. Some of us have walked through incredibly difficult things, and it doesn't feel like our life is ever going to be the same. Some of us can relate to the brokenness of Rahab, just sitting amidst your life feeling like it is in shatters. Some of us remember that and have pieced things back together. Some of us, maybe we're not broken into 1,000 pieces, but it's a couple. We all struggle with value. We all struggle with feeling good enough. We all struggle with unselfishly loving others. We are all, in our own ways, broken. And so as I thought about Rahab and her brokenness, and us and ours, I wanted to find a picture of something beautiful being made from something that's broken. So I did what any good pastor does, and I Googled things. And I found the perfect picture. I want to show you guys this bowl. That bowl is an example of the Japanese art of kintsugi. That's how you know I Googled it. I don't know what that is, man. I just started learning about this week. That's an example of the Japanese art of kintsugi. And what kintsugi is to take something that's broken and fashion it back together in a way that is beautiful. And what they would normally do, what you normally try to do when your bowl was broken, is you try to piece it back together so that nobody would ever know it was broken, so that when you used it as a dinner party, people wouldn't know that you had dropped it on the floor once, and no one would ever know that it had been broken before. But kintsugi says, no, we're not going to do that. We're actually going to make the brokenness beautiful. We're going to fill the cracks with gold, and we're not going to try to hide the past from anybody. And in doing this, it actually becomes more beautiful than it was before. And I think that this is a picture of what God does with us. God took Rahab, this broken prostitute from Jericho, and wrote her into his family story. So that when we look at her story now, when we look through Matthew now, when we look at those names, married to Salmon and then had Boaz and Obed and Jesse and David and on down all the way to Jesus, we see the bowl. We see the thing that God pieced back together. We see the brokenness and all of its beauty, and God doesn't attempt to hide it. He doesn't say that there was a woman of faith from Jericho. He tells us who she was. He doesn't attempt to hide her faults. He makes them beautiful. And I want us to know this morning that if you feel broken, whether it's completely shattered or just missing a couple pieces, if you've been scrambling to kind of try to fix your life and put it back together in a way that makes sense, in a way that feels whole, in a way that feels beautiful, in a way that gives you meaning, I want you to know that God is doing that for you. And that you don't have to hide those cracks. And you don't have to pretend like you were never broken. And you don't have to pretend like you were always all right. Because God is making something beautiful out of you. And all we have to do is respond with faithful obedience. Now, some of you might not believe me. Some of you might think I've heard stuff like this before. I've got too much sin. I've got too much stuff. God's not going to use me. He's not writing me into his family tree. He doesn't have any big grand plans for me. I guarantee you, if you went to Rahab a month before those spies hid out at her house, and you said, hey, Rahab, you want to know something cool? The Hebrew God that you're scared of, he's going to use you. He's going to set you up for all of history on par with all the heroes who have preceded you. He's going to write you into his family tree, and he is making beauty out of your brokenness. She'd have told you were crazy. She would have sat right where you are, thinking right what you're thinking. Not me. Not possible. That's silly. Here's what I want you to know. When God looked at Rahab, he didn't see what she was. He saw what he was going to make her into. When God looked at Rahab, he didn't see what she was. He didn't see a broken prostitute in Jericho living a hopeless life. He saw the great-great-grandmother of King David. He saw the mom that he was going to entrust to raise Boaz. He saw somebody that he was going to write into his own son's family tree. When God looked at Rahab, he did not see what she saw. He saw what he was going to create. And I want you to know that God looks at you with those same eyes. And all Rahab did was respond with the next step of obedience. She didn't understand all the things. She didn't get all the religion. She didn't know where it was going to go. She didn't understand the Bible. She couldn't quote to you verses. She didn't even know what theology was. She wasn't even a Christian. She just took the first step of obedience. And God began to craft beauty out of her brokenness. And I want you to know this morning that God wants to make something beautiful out of you. Not just in the way that he removed Rahab from her life immediately, but as he wrote a beautiful story about her for generations to come. God has beauty that he's creating you into. You have no idea who your children will come in contact with. You have no idea what kind of grandchildren they're going to have. But God sees them already, and he's fashioning you into that beauty. And all we have to do is to continue, like Rahab, to respond with faithful obedience. And I believe that God will make beauty out of our brokenness as well. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the story of Rahab. Thank you for including people like that in your Bible. God, we love to learn about David and Moses and these men who were leaders. But God, sometimes that feels so far away from us. We thank you for regular people that you used in extraordinary ways. Father, if we are broken, I just pray that we would trust you to restore us and to make beauty out of that. Father, I pray that maybe most of all, would see what you see when we look at ourselves. We thank you that you don't see us now as we are, but you see us as what you want to make us into. And I just pray for us that you would give us the courage and the faith to take the next step of obedience as you make beauty out of the things in our life that are broken. It's in your Son's name we ask these things. Amen.